Welcome to A Considerate Life. Today, we were supposed to talk about the philosophy of gender. But as I was thinking about all of the different pieces of philosophy that I wanted to bring to bear on the notion of, or the issue of gender, I realized that there was too much to deal with in just one video. So today we're going to do something that I'm just going to call Philosophy 101. We're going to answer 4 questions. What is philosophy? What is good philosophy? What is Christian philosophy? And what is my philosophy? And then this will just function as a standalone video for issues in the future. These are the principles that I'm going to be working from, and these are the principles that I'm going to be applying to other issues in the future. Now, the reason I wanted to start with this is, here's the analogy. If I wanted to teach you how to fix a car engine, and you knew nothing about car engines, and you knew nothing about the tools used to fix those, I could have one of two approaches. I could begin fixing the engine and then just simply telling you what the tools do along the way as they fix the engine. Or I could lay the tools out and I could show you what each of the tools do, a wrench, a socket wrench, a screwdriver, whatever, and let you know what the tools do independent of the specific issue of fixing the car engine. The first is more immediate and accessible. The second is more methodical. And as you might imagine, I chose the second route. So we're going to be working through the tools of philosophy, and these are going to be principled truths regardless of what we apply them to. Now, in the next video, we'll apply them to the notion of gender, and we'll have a specifically philosophical analysis of gender. But today, I just want to answer those 4 broad questions, starting again with, what is philosophy? Now, as most other things, philosophers disagree among themselves about what philosophy is, but one of the best sort of concise definitions is from John Haldane, and he says here, what marks out an investigation as philosophical is its concern to provide ultimate explanations and understanding, or failing this, to find some other final or halting description, such as mystery or brute fact. And we would add to that something like ultimate being, because, for example, Christian philosophers will find an ultimate stopping point in God for some issues. So that's a brief explanation of what philosophy is. Philosophy aims at getting at ultimate explanations. So my go-to example is something like physics. Physics might talk about how particle A causes particle B, or causes some shift in some physical or energetic system. But philosophy wants to delve into the notion of causality per se. That is, what is causality itself? Besides the pushing and pulling causes, besides the political causes, what does it mean for a thing A to cause B, regardless of what kind of causation that is? Is there some sort of ultimate form of causality that is causality per se, and then under which all the other notions of causality fall? So that's the kind of thing that Haldane has in mind as he's thinking of ultimate stopping points for understanding or explanation. Besides the general statement about the nature of philosophy, we want to look at the 3 major branches of philosophy and then its analytic tool. So the 3 major branches of philosophy, for simplicity's sake, are metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Now, metaphysics will study things like being versus non-being, abstract objects versus concrete particulars, the nature of time, the nature of causality, possibility, necessity, things like that. Epistemology deals with theories of human knowing, that is, what we know and how we know. And then finally, ethics is a branch of axiology. It studies moral values. It studies the good, the right, the just, right? Things like that, as opposed to aesthetic value or political value, right? So those are the 3 main branches. And what we'll do in this video is we'll go through each of those particular branches, and I will tell you what tradition I use or utilize in my Christian philosophy. Now, the analytic tool that we use is logic. Now, I've taught Aristotelian logic, I've taught symbolic logic, maybe a little bit of modal logic. But logic is the analytic tool for philosophers because philosophers try and get at not quantitative analysis, that's more done in the natural sciences, but qualitative logical analysis of concepts, ideas, and their empirical grounding and their implications, right? So we talked about in the faith versus reason talk, we talked about one of the things that reason does is it draws conclusions via inferences, hopefully in sound arguments, valid inferences, true propositions, and sound arguments. And the example we gave there was all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. There we have, we're using a syllogism, the two premises and a conclusion, and the inferences between those to secure the soundness of our final judgment, and that is Socrates is mortal, right? I don't want to cover that again. So those are the three main branches and the analytic tool of logic. Now the question is, what makes good philosophy? So this is, what is philosophy? Here are the major branches of philosophy. And it should be noted that besides the major branches of philosophy and logic, there's also the history of philosophy, the history of ideas. So not only will philosophers look at things like time, they'll look at how other philosophers have talked about the philosophy of time. And then we debate one another over these issues, and that itself, that debate becomes part of the history of philosophy. So don't want to leave that aside. Now back to the question: what is good philosophy? If that's what philosophy is in a nutshell, what is good philosophy? And to this, we're gonna turn to Frederick Wilhelmsen's introduction to Gilson's Thomistic Realism and the Critique of Knowledge. So Wilhelmsen says this about Gilson, and Gilson is a philosopher that I'm going to be quoting periodically on this channel. He says this: Gilson is a meat and potatoes philosopher for whom the hard solidity of the world was an article of sanity. So the tradition that we're going to be looking at is going to be an Aristotelian Thomistic tradition that is very much rooted in a kind of realism. Now, if you're familiar with philosophy, you know there's a debate over Platonic realism versus nominalism, things like that. For me, good philosophy is always going to be some stripe of realism. Good philosophy for me is philosophy that takes our what are called pre-philosophical notions or intuitions or knowledge, and it simply gives an explanation of what we already know pre-philosophically. It gives a philosophical explanation for that. So in my mind, good philosophy never runs towards skepticism or idealism or things like that, or solipsism. We know that there are things that exist outside of us, and we know that we know that. So what are those things? How do they exist? How is it that we know that they exist? And what should we do about their existence given our own existence? Right? This is metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics done in a way that never divorces the philosopher from the reality in which he lives, right? That, I think, is good philosophy. Now, that's what is philosophy, what is good philosophy, but what is Christian philosophy? Christian philosophy simply uses the tools of philosophy and brings them to bear on a Christian theology or a Christian perspective on things. And this is why this channel, A Considerate Life, is a way of it does that. It uses oftentimes the tools of philosophy to ground or analyze or give a Christian perspective on some issue. And this is what we're going to do when we get to the philosophy of gender. And then later after that, we'll do a theology of gender. So I can highlight the distinction between doing a philosophical analysis and then doing a theology of some issue. And we'll pick gender because it's much talked about these days. Now, in the medieval era, it was understood that, and here's the phrase, philosophy is the handmaiden to theology, right? A handmaiden is one who serves the queen, serves royalty, right? So theology was known as the queen of the sciences, and philosophy was her handmaid or handmaiden. And so I think that's a good way of imagining what philosophy is in relation to theology and what Christian philosophy is in particular. Now, there are Christian philosophers who are wildly different in their philosophies. So we have Augustine and Anselm and Aquinas. We have Kierkegaard and Marcel. We have Plantinga and Craig and Fraser. They're all different kinds of philosophers. Some are Platonists, some are anti-Platonists, some are Aristotelian-Thomists, my favorite. And so what unifies them is their aim. Their aim is to try to say something that is philosophically rigorous about things that bear on aspects of the Christian faith. So that's what is philosophy, what is good philosophy, and a brief explanation of what is Christian philosophy. And finally, what is my philosophy? Before we talk about that, I want to talk about one more element. As philosophers are going through their metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, etc., they can do so in at least a continuum of two ways. One, they can be systematic in their approach, and that is to try and find underlying principles of their metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, etc., that all work together to create a system of thinking. And then on the other side, there's what we might call just a loose eclecticism, and that is one's commitments about the nature of time don't necessarily commit them to their understanding of philosophy of mind or abstract objects or natural law or ethics or whatever. And so the loose eclecticism gives the philosopher the kind of freedom to sort of build this sort of smorgasbord of positions. For me, a systematic approach is more satisfying. If you're going to do a true philosophy, if you're going to do a philosophy that can be as systematic philosophically as your systematic theology is, and I think a Christian philosopher should aim to do just that, to have a systematic philosophy that can abut or aid their systematic theology in building a coherent Christian worldview. That I think is the most satisfying. And in that, I find myself in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, much like an Ed Feser, Gilson, Joseph Owens, John Whipple. These are my guys. These are the guys that I follow. These are the guys that I agree with, from whom I draw elaboration of these principles. And so because I'm attracted to a system of philosophy, I'm attracted to a Aristotelian Thomistic system of philosophy. So where you would locate me in sort of a map of ideology would be a Protestant, evangelical, Thomist, existentialist, realist, or Peter, to have a good acronym there. Okay, so now that we've gone over our four main questions, what is philosophy, what is good philosophy, what is Christian philosophy, and what is my philosophy? Now we want to start going through these major branches of philosophy in order to set the pieces in place for us to then do a philosophy of gender in the next video. So the pieces that we need in place in order to talk about a philosophy of gender are these, I think. First, there is a philosophy of nature. And in Aristotelian Thomism, mainly coming from Aristotle, we have a tradition or a position called hylomorphism. Hylomorphism just means matter and form, right? That means, we talked earlier in metaphysics, deals with abstract objects versus concrete particulars. In concrete particulars, that is, the individual things that populate our universe of material objects, every concrete particular is a composite of two intrinsic metaphysical principles of being. They are form and matter. Form is the principle, in shorthand, that gives an intelligible structure to a thing. It makes it formed the way that it is, and it makes it knowable as the thing that it is. And then the matter is, for lack of a better phrase, it's its underlying physicality, concreteness. right? So if you think about a statue, a marble statue, specifically the statue of David, right? We see that it has an intelligible structure that makes it different from just a pile of rubble. It makes it different from an uncarved block of marble, and it makes it different from other carved statues, right? This intelligible structure is what we think of as the form. And then the marble happens to be the matter out of which the statue is made, and it grounds its underlying physicality. So having these two metaphysical principles in place, form and matter, give us a way of defining and distinguishing every kind of concrete particular. So besides form and matter, this hylomorphism about all concrete particulars, when it gets to humans, or when it gets to living things, there are inanimate forms of, like, say, carbon, and animate forms for plants, animals, and humans. We can maybe look at the different living forms and the different kinds of souls, as Aristotle calls them. A soul is just a living form that animates a body. So as opposed to being inanimate, humans have a rational soul. The rational soul is the substantial form of the body. So for humans, as form matter composites, our forms are living forms in that we're alive instead of just inert matter. And we are rational, which is what distinguishes us from plants and animals as living souls or animating souls. So the specific form and matter composition that humans have is what we call the soul-body relationship. And when we get into the philosophy of gender, we'll ask the question, is gender something that pertains to the soul, or does it pertain to the body? Because if humans are this form matter composition, then gender has to be located in one of these fundamental principles of our existence. Is it a soul quality, or is it part of the body? Now, form not only being the intelligible structure of things, but form makes things what they are, right? And here we get into the 10 Aristotelian categories. They are substance, quality, quantity, relation, action, passion, time, place, position, and possession. And just, again, briefly going through all of these, substantial form is the primary metaphysical category that defines what something is. So there's form and matter, and then among form, there are substantial forms and what are called accidental forms. Substantial forms are the form of the species. They make it the kind of thing that it is, and then all of the other things are accidental. Now, let's briefly run through the 9 what are called predicamental accidents. 9 accidents, ways we predicate things. So quantity, quality, relation, action, passion, time, place, position, and possession. Now, the first 2 are what are called intrinsic accidents. So dimensive quantity and quality. Dimensive quantity can refer to the species, that is, the way humans, giraffes, and elephants all look different because of the kind of species they are. But it also goes down to male and female of the species that have different dimensive quantities. So like a male lion has a mane and a female lion doesn't have a mane. There are things that are shaped differently about the male and female of the species. And Aquinas will call these accidents properties because they're directly related to the kind of substance that the thing is. They're not substantial form. Having a mane doesn't make a lion, but it does make a lion a male lion. So you can see how quantity is directly related to the kind of substance a thing is. Qualities are a little harder to pin down. Qualities can be things like being tan versus being pale. And also things like, for Aristotle, the virtues. The virtues are qualities of soul that change. So these are qualitative changes that are inherent in the subject. This is why the quantity and quality are inherent accidents. Now, as we start getting further down the list of accidents, we get a little bit further removed from the subject. So the substance makes it what it is. quantity and quality are inherent, intrinsic accidents. Then relation starts to get a little bit more extrinsic to the subject. Relations are things like being the father of, or being the mother of, being to the left of, or being to the right of. It places the subject in a relation to its term. So there's a subject, a term, and then there's a relationship between the two. So the famous one from Bertrand Russell is that Edinburgh is to the north of London, right? To the north of is a relation that London has with, or that Edinburgh has with London. Edinburgh is the subject, London is the term, and north of is the relation. Okay. Jeffrey Brower has a relatively recent book on this called Aquinas' Ontology of the Material World. And here Brower says something, and I think he's right about this, that after we get past substance, quantity, quality, once we get to relation, those are the four main forms, substantial and accidental forms. Once we get past relation, action, passion, time, place, position, and possession are all varieties of relation. So, for example, action and passion. If you think of walking on a beach and leaving footprints behind, the action is done by the foot or the agent, and the passion or the patient is the sand. The foot is making the impression, and the sand is receiving the impression. So in this one act of causality, we have an agent-patient relationship between the foot and the footprint. So that's an example of the agent-patient or the action-passion. Time and place are pretty obvious. Time and place are considered extrinsically denominated accidents. They're accidents that are even more removed from the person. Your birth date, all of these things about time are related to some form of local motion. That is, day is related to the sun or the Earth's rotation and sunrise and sunset. Years are related to the Earth's orbit around its nearest star, the sun. Right? So time is extrinsically denominated, related to something else. So is place. If I said, I'm in my office, and I would say it's in the corner room of my house, and my house is located on this street. So every time I try and explain to you where I am, it's always in relation to some other point of space. And so this is why it's an extrinsic accident. So that's action, passion, time, place. Position and possession. Position are things like lying down, seated, standing. These are changes of position without being changes of the self. And then possession, the example that Stump always gave was having socks on or having shoes on, being socked or shod, as it were. So those are the that's the substantial form and the 9 predicamental accidents, and those are Aristotle's complete categories of being. You have the substantial form that makes something what it is. It makes it an ontological unit of the kind that it is. And then all of these other accidents are either more or less intrinsically or extrinsically related to changes of the subject, right? So that's kind of a run through of the Aristotelian 10 categories, and it's going to play a role as we have discussions on other subjects later on. So those are the big pieces of metaphysics that we'll need to address a philosophy of gender. Humans are a form-matter composition. Our form is a living form. Those living forms are called souls. And the specific difference for humans is that we have a rational soul. Our rational soul in the 10 categories functions as our substantial form. It makes us what we are. And our matter makes us the individuals that we are. So, for example, John Whipple will talk about form and matter are themselves abstractions. That is, they're just sort of idealizations of these principles. But what actually exists in the world is informed matter and individuated form, right? So form and matter don't exist independent of one another. Form is always informing some underlying physicality, some piece of matter, and matter is always individuating a form. So my form, my rational soul makes me a human being as a substantial form. And my matter makes me this particular human being. It individuates form. So this is why you and I can both be human, but you're that human and I'm this human. The humanity ranges over our essence. It makes us what we are. And our matter makes us individuated as different individuals of the same metaphysical kind. We have to move a little bit more quickly through our epistemology and ethics, but let me just say this. Epistemology, for me, really follows on our underlying philosophical anthropology, right? So I think it's wrong to ask the question, what is knowledge? I think it's better to ask the question, what is human knowing? Because if there's God and angels and frogs, their knowing follows on the kind of being that they are, right? So there's the knower, there's the thing known, and knowledge is the thing that emerges between the two. Now, how does that happen? And here I'll turn to a quote from Jill Sohn. True, the senses can only grasp particulars and the intellect universals. But sense and intellect are not distinct entities at war with each other. They are powers of a single knowing subject, and through their mutual interpenetration, the intellect sees the universal in the singular. Man has two essential knowing powers. He has sensation, the five senses, sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And via the five senses, he is brought into contact with what we call the extra-mental world, the world outside the mind, the world outside of us as we come to know it through the senses. And then at the same time, man has a distinct, not separate, but a distinct knowing power, namely the intellect or the mind. And so what Wilhelmsen and then Jill Sohn call the mutual interpenetration of the senses by the intellect. Now, those two pieces together, this mutual interpenetration of the senses and the intellect, are the foundation for this Aristotelian-Thomistic, what's called a classical empiricism. And the old adage is that there's nothing in the mind that wasn't first in the senses. So what we know, how we call things, it begins with our understanding of the physical reality around us. And then by understanding that reality, the intellect penetrates this sense data. There's no raw sense data. The intellect is there, penetrating the sense data, because the senses don't know anything and the intellect doesn't know anything. It's the human being that knows things in their particularity via the senses and through and in their universality by the interpenetration of the intellect. So we're going to see that be brought to bear in the next video. Now, the last major branch of philosophy is ethics, and this is my weakest area. I have avoided studying things like ethics, aesthetics, and political philosophy. For completeness' sake, I'll say this. If you looked at the theological virtues and the cardinal virtues videos, you'll know that for Aristotle, the cardinal virtues, things like wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage, they qualitatively change the nature of the individual so that you're not just human, but you're a good human. Or if you indulge in the vices, you become something like a bad human. So I think those are all the pieces that we need in place. The form, matter, composition of human beings as soul and body. The nature of human knowing, starting with the senses and then becoming true ideas in the mind via the intellect's penetration of the senses. And then the cardinal virtues, these notions of wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance as they shape the human himself and then human behavior as we live in society together. So that's Philosophy 101. That answers the question, what is philosophy? What is good philosophy? What is Christian philosophy? What is my philosophy? And then all of those different pieces and parts that'll be brought to bear on things like a philosophy of gender. We'll do that next time.